welcome back to another episode of California Mortgage Bankers Association Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion podcast. Today, I have with me Eric Bryant. He's the Director of Operations at Openn North America, and he has a pretty storied career actually in the real estate industry. Have worked for some of the bigger names in the past. But before we get into his journey, some of the things that he wants to talk about, diversity and inclusion, I would like to welcome him to the show here. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sure. And just to remind, this episode and this podcast is sponsored by Prime Lending. Now, Eric, before we get into Openn, let's just talk about your journey leading up to Openn. You've worked for some of the bigger real estate companies in the past here in the US. Just talk to us about your career leading up to Openn.
You called it a storied career. I'm not sure that's quite the way I would describe it. I think it was a career bent on desperation. But way back when, in the 1990s, I found myself divorced with 3 kids, and I needed to make a move to. Then I lived in the Bay Area. And I needed to make a move into the California Central Valley just to slow things down a little bit and be able to handle being a single dad.
Yeah, I can vouch for that, being from Silicon Valley. Is that?
Oh my God,
it's the Bay Area to move out. Yes,
there's so many things to do, so much trouble to get into. You know, as they were young, they were 7, 5, and 1 at the time, but once they became teenagers, the Bay Area was not the place I wanted them. So I moved to the Central Valley, and at the time I was working for AT&T, actually Pacific Bell, who was later purchased by AT&T. And they didn't have a spot in the Central Valley. So I ended up buying a small business called Flyers for You. Never forget that, Flyers for You. And what they did was they just created printed materials for about 350 real estate agents in the Central Valley. Mm-hmm. So I turned that into a digital business versus print, and started to digitize the business for them, expanded the amount of customers that we had, and eventually I was picked up by a larger broker in that marketplace, and that was my introduction to real estate. The brokers said, I see what you're doing. We're trying to digitize. It was 25 years ago, so digitization at that point in time was quite unique. Mm-hmm. He had 15, 16 offices up and down the valley, so it was a good size. A bunch of great people, and I kind of got my feet wet there, starting with individual websites and IDX and social media and all the things, the CRMs that came. And that's where, so it grew into eventually a consulting business where I was, and that's kind of where the coach fits into the career. It actually started because I have 3 very athletic children. Mm-hmm. And growing up, I coached them all through their sports and on into high school. But it kind of transferred over to business because I was a consultant, I was teaching, I was coaching in some way. And so the RE coach was born. I spent about 20 years working with the big brands, larger teams, brokerages, on understanding technology, building some kind of educational pieces, and then handing it over to a brokerage and moving on to the next. So I got to see the growth of just about every technology. I had to keep myself about 1 to 2 years ahead of the technologies that were coming out so that I was ready and prepared to help people. And then late in my career, just before Openn, I went to work for First American Data and Analytics, mm-hmm. Just a national accounts director for the data company. So I got to learn something from a different perspective, right? The data, the underlying data, public record data, mortgage and deed data, all that kind of stuff was in my quiver, and I was able to learn that. And then one day, this little company comes to me for some data, and they're out of Australia, but they're looking for a North American expansion. It was called Openn. Okay. And so, one thing led to another, and I fell in love with the company. That I just loved the people in Australia that were running it, and here I am as a North American director of operations. So anything in Canada and the US gets to run across my desk.
Very cool. Yeah. Before we jump onto Openn, I know that you have been driven to increase diversity in real estate. What do you see the challenge with driving diversity. I mean, before we come to some of the solutions and even some of the things that you're doing at Openn, what have you seen? I mean, you have been in the US real estate industry now, as you yourself said, for over 2 decades. What are some things that you have personally seen that is preventing the say more diverse real estate opportunities and more diverse real estate careers?
I think it all comes down to human bias and the fact that the industry, I mean, let's think back just for a second. I know it was 25 years ago, 30 years ago, but that's not that far when you think about it. I mean, it's the 1990s. This industry, the real estate industry, was working out of a book, of a paper book that was delivered to a real estate office on a weekly basis. And that book had listings in it. This is pre-Zillow, pre-realtor.com, right? Internet was just getting started. It was a book 30 years ago. So it's not as if, we have this storied history of technology. I know it's quick, it was quick to adapt and adopt and all that, but it was a book. And everything had to go through an agent. They had incredible power, right? They were the keeper of the information. Mm-hmm. Because you had to, a young couple picture them, they had to go to the office, meet with the agent, sit down and go through a book with a single picture in black and white and a small description of the property. Well, we didn't adopt very much in the first 10 years, and then we started to, but we were always, the industry was always the keepers of information, and that tends to lead to issues. And one of them happens to be diversity and inclusion, right? If you have the power to keep information from the individuals who most need that information, the buyers and sellers, something's wrong, right? And it continues today. And it's one of the reasons I went to work for Openn is to open up that opportunity to stop having those walls up, because they allow bad actors, which are part of every industry and every society. But we had rules, or we had systems that literally allowed these people to do the things that they did. And one of them was to discriminate. And, after a while, you work in a business for 20, 25, 30 years, you get to love and appreciate everyone in it and make so many friends, but you're embarrassed every once in a while. And I'm embarrassed and have been embarrassed for quite some time on our record with diversity and inclusion. I think it sucks.
Yeah, I've been talking for a long time about moving from what I call information asymmetry to information symmetry, which is information asymmetry is a state where agents and sellers and people have more information about the product and the services they are selling than the buyers. In this case, as you mentioned, if I was the agent and I had this handbook and I only knew which homes were up for sale, then I can pick and choose what information to give. That's information asymmetry, right? Until we move to a state where there's full transparency on what is being sold, what are the kind of offers being sent, what are the conditions on those offers. If I'm not fully transparent to it, I as a listing agent control that information. And even though we know that as a rule, the listing agent is not supposed to share that, we all know that they share based on who they like and who they don't, right? This other agent who is representing a certain buyer went to high school with me. I'll give that agent a little bit more information. You know what? You want to send $1.5 million? Maybe you want to go slightly higher. I might have 3 offers, that might be in that range. So you're right. Until that information asymmetry becomes a full symmetry, which is full transparency in the entire process, we will always have this problem of somebody else deciding who gets to see this home and who gets to buy this home. So that brings me to Openn. I mean, as the name suggests, it is a fairly open platform. What are the biases that you saw that Openn is trying to solve, and how is it trying to solve it?
By the way, that brief description you just made was fantastic, and you really should come to work for me, because that is exactly how we go to work every day. We build our day on 3 pillars: transparency, equality, and efficiency. And it's the first 2 that we're really talking about today. Efficiency is the fact that anytime you put something into software that was otherwise manual, right, you're increasing efficiencies and economies of scale and all that kind of stuff. So the efficiency part, let's just say we don't know why. We can suspect why it wasn't in software previously, but now the transaction is in software. But the first 2, transparency and equality, are what relate to today's subject matter and the transparency you spoke of so eloquently, in that why doesn't everyone who's involved in the transaction have similar information? Now, I'm not saying the same, because there's a difference between the agent representing the seller and the agent representing the buyer, what they can and can't see. And we account for that, right? Permission based. But for the buyer and the seller, they have their own dashboards. They get to see what's going on. If I put in an offer of $550,000, I get to see approximately where that ranks in the other offers. And I can make an educated and informed decision with my agent to determine if I want to stay in this process or move on to another property. Why am I wasting my time where I'm probably not supposed to be? There are a lot of things that come out of this, but basically it's the basic principle of, hey, these people should have this information. They're making a decision worth 500, 600. I happen to come from Southern California, so it's millions of dollars when you make your decisions. To have them uneducated in the offer and acceptance process and negotiation process is an absolute tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy. And until we did recently put this in software, and I'm talking about Openn as a company and the industry as a whole of offer management, because I have competitors. It's not as if I'm the only one out there. All of us together create this opportunity for a fair and open platform. The second thing, and I have to be honest with you, because we started 6 years ago in Australia, recently came to North America, just very recently. In Australia, we didn't set out to, but we found that by putting the process into software, we actually took a huge step forward in equality or diversity and inclusion, because software as a whole doesn't see race, creed, color, or religious sexual preference. It just sees terms and conditions and dollar amount. And that's what it's supposed to. Now, we can't eliminate the human bias, right? But we put this into software. It's date and time stamped, and everything is noted in the software. So if I decide as a listing agent that I'm going to treat someone differently based on the color of their skin or the last name or their heritage, that software is going to rat you out, because it's going to show the difference. There was eight buyers, and one of them seemed to stand out as being treated differently. Their offer wasn't presented to the seller in a timely manner. They were asked to do something different than the other 7. The software allows us to do that. So while we can't eliminate the bias by putting it into our software, we can sure take a big step forward. And so we as a company, and again, honesty, right? We didn't set out to help on the diversity and inclusion side, but we found out that we could, and now we push it and we emphasize it and we build on it, because it's probably the most happy accident I've had in my career.
Yeah, especially if you're driven to diversity in real estate, that's definitely
we have to fix this. It's ridiculous that we don't fix it. And we have a saying at the company, and it's, if you're not using Openn, what are you hiding?
I like that. Transparency, equality, and efficiency. I mean, those are the 3 pillars of any diversity and inclusion program, really. If you can build on that, then that's perfect. Now, Eric, you had mentioned about an announcement that Ontario Real Estate Association came out. I think of course, that's a Canadian market, and they mentioned that the housing affordability is a growing problem across Canada, as it's in the US, but one that disproportionately affect people of color and LGBT communities, who, of course, as we know, experience higher barriers to housing attainment due to historically discriminatory practices. Now, what was the announcement that came out, which was so significant, even though it is in a neighboring country? And what do you think American MLSs can learn from it, or where do you see American MLSs going with that? Would they pay attention to something what is happening, say, in Canada?
Answering the latter first, yes, they will pay attention. I think that it's funny, because in this particular instance, we're talking about the US reacting to Canada. For the most part, 90% of the time, Canada reacts to the US. And it goes back to a very interesting dynamic in our company is originally
Mhm.
I was hired as the director of operations for the United States. We did not have in our plan to go to Canada. I was once we began the process, I the Canadian Real Estate Association, CREA, reached out to us and said, would you come to Canada? Would you think about coming to Canada? Through long negotiations, we did. Now it's North America that we service. So in this particular case, our Canadian brothers to the north took a step forward before we did down here, which is a little bit different, right? And I'm very proud of them. And what you're referencing as far as that article, it was an article by OREA, and that's the Ontario Real Estate Association. They're part of the regulatory body system. They're not an MLS or a board or a brokerage or anything like that. They're part of the regulatory system. They basically printed an article that called out the industry and said, we need to do better. And they gave some examples of the history of the industry and how it wasn't hitting the marks for diversity and inclusion. And I was really proud that they took that step. It's, normally everybody stays in this safe lane and doesn't say anything. And here we have a regulatory body that's coming up and stepping up. Now, it could be a reactionary thing because the Canadian government, just as the Department of Justice here in the United States, are kind of putting a little pressure on the industry to say, there's a couple of things you need to clean up. One of them is diversity and inclusion, which is long overdue. The other, thankfully for us, is transparency and openness in the process. So you've got this, you've got these exogenous pressures, right? You've got governments pushing down, and you've got consumers who are basically now millennials and a younger group of a younger generation that's supplying most of the business. You got them with upward pressure saying, give me this transparency that I deserve. And for crying out loud, allow me to do this on my phone or my tablet or my mobile device, whatever it might be. This is absolutely insane that I have to drop off a FedEx package or send a PDF or some other, and God forbid they're still faxing it. And I'll bet you somewhere there's a buyer's agent faxing in an offer to a listing agent. And so those pressures are leading to articles like that and organizations like OREA stepping up. Now, you asked if I saw that it would spill over into the US. 100% it will. And the reason I'm so confident is because I do have that 25 to 30 years experience in this industry. I've seen a lot of things come down the pipe. More doors have opened for me in the last 6 to 8 months when I want to talk to a CEO, a CTO, a COO of an MLS or a board or even a large brokerage or brand. They are listening to this story about transparency and equality. Their ears are open. Now, does that mean they're all jumping on board and saying, hey, we'll sign a contract? No, but what used to take us 2 years to get an appointment to talk about now takes us about 2 months to get that appointment and talk about it. And they're listening, and we're giving demonstrations on almost a daily basis to these executives for these MLSs. Is it going to transfer into everybody putting the process into software, whether it's with us or one of our competitors? I can't tell you that because the industry is, it's got its struggles when it comes to this kind of stuff, but they're listening, which is a huge step forward. And I think that it's going to take one brokerage, one brand, one large MLS or medium-sized MLS. One of them is going to step out, because that's what happened in Australia, right? You had a couple brokerages that were getting their butts kicked in Western Australia. The brands were killing them, and they said, you know what? We have nothing to lose. Let's take this new technology, run with it, market it, and see what happens. We're going to take a shot, basically. So they went from 3% market share, and today those guys are right around 30% market share. So they 10x their business by giving the consumer what they wanted. Same thing's going to take place here in the US and Canada, right? Someone's going to step up and they're going to say, we are pro-consumer. We realize transparency is important, and we want to do something about diversity and inclusion. Now, whether that's from the heart or from the checkbook, I don't care. I need somebody to step up and do that, because then the FOMO sets in, and then we start to see real progress in both of those arenas, especially our conversation today around diversity and inclusion.
No, totally makes sense. And that's why, I mean, I keep harping on the fact that what we are fighting for is equal housing opportunity. We are not saying equal housing, say, percentage or ratio or something. The opportunity should be there. You need to be what you started as you said, and find it more serendipitous is the fact that inclusion just happened because of transparency. And that's what really what we are fighting for in terms of diversity and inclusion is let everything be transparent. If Black homeowners are declined at 84% higher rate than white, let's just be transparent about it. Let's share the data. If that's actually the fact that they should be declined at 84% higher, then that's fine. But let's look at the data. Is that really true? Because once we are transparent, then it will lead to higher inclusion. Once we have more housing opportunity, equal housing opportunity, then it will lead for more minority home ownership. But one thing that you mentioned that I really liked, and a feeling that a lot of our guests share, is the fact that there is a lot of conversation around diversity and inclusion, which is a huge, huge first step. Because you're right, and 5 and 10 years back, we were probably not even talking about DE&I. It wasn't in any CEO's agenda, so to say. The fact that they are open to having conversation with someone like Openn, the fact that they come on podcasts like this that I host and part of conversation around it, that means that once there is conversation, then it leads to action. And that's what our hope is, Eric, you and ours, and some of the other people fighting for it, that if they take the action, then hopefully we're not talking of the same problems 5 years down the road that has been there for decades within the housing industry in Canada, in the US, and in multiple markets. And that's something that hopefully we don't get to talk down the road.
That's the goal, right? As embarrassed as I am about the history of the industry I work in, I'm equally as proud of the present because of what we just talked about. And you may not know this. I don't know if it's in any of my bios or anything, but I'm 60, right? I got a couple of years left. I've done everything I can do in my career, but I haven't made what I would consider a noticeable difference to the industry. I haven't done anything for my children and their peers to really to be able to go back and sit on a porch somewhere and have a glass of wine and say, I was a part of that. I did that. Now I do. Yeah. And it changes the way you get up in the morning, because when everything comes at you and the stress builds, you can say to yourself, we're working hard to make a difference. And, I've got this much time left. And so when people ask me questions about transparency and equality, I'm on it, because I don't have time I don't have the time to waste. But we have to focus on this, and we have to do something. There's no reason why this part of the transaction, why the negotiation, the dollars aren't in software where we can protect it, we can increase the efficiencies on it, and actually provide a cost savings as well. So so many good things come out of what we're trying to do at Openn, and what the industry of offer management is doing as a whole.
Thank you, Eric. We've come to the end of our time, but really appreciate not just what you shared here, but what you're doing to drive diversity and inclusion. So thanks for being on the show.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that was another episode of California Mortgage Bankers Association Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion podcast with special guest Eric Bryant. My name is Shashank. I'm the founder and CEO of Insta Mortgage, and this was a podcast that was sponsored by Prime Lending. Until I see you again, stay well.